97. 97 is the number of children in the United Kingdom who have been referred to who were referred to gender identity clinics in 2009, 1 year before the enactment of the UK's 2010 Equality Act. 2,519. That is the number of children referred to gender identity clinics in the UK just last year. How did we get from 97 children to 2,519 children in such a short span of time? The answer is that this situation is nothing short of a national safeguarding scandal. Children as young as 4 are being read books celebrating cross-dressing, transgenderism, and alternative sexual lifestyles. I put together a few slides just to give you an idea of some of what has made its way into our schools in the United Kingdom. Now, while it is a fact that transgender people and LGBT people exist and are part of our communities, and that schools should be teaching children the value of loving one's neighbor, far too often what is taught in schools goes far beyond this boundary. Not too long ago, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government, Section 28 was introduced into the Education Act, which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality to children. Now, in England and Wales, Section 28 was repealed only in 2003. The pace at which social change has occurred since then is startling. In 2010, the United Kingdom adopted the Equality Act, which consolidated all of the different pieces of equality legislation into a single statute. Within the Act, gender reassignment and sexual orientation were designated as protected characteristics for which discrimination was prohibited. The Act also created an obligation on schools which received state funding to promote tolerance towards protected groups, including those who identify as homosexual or transgender. Many schools acted with zeal in introducing very mature and complex themes to children regarding what the majority of people would call alternative lifestyles. Recently, the UK government has also adopted new regulations on so-called relationships education, which makes including teaching about homosexuality and transgenderism mandatory in England. This would include private schools, religious schools, and primary schools. So parents now have no legal right to withdraw their children from these lessons. As a result of these changes in law and culture, the issue of transgender ideology in children in schools has come to the forefront of public dialogue. Credible studies from Johns Hopkins Medical School, the same school I talked about in my first part of the presentation, where Dr. John Money had worked previously, as well as other scholars, have stated that in up to 98 out of 100 children who suffer gender confusion, the children will settle into their biological sex as they pass through puberty. In the UK, even the very liberal and transgender affirming Tavistock clinics suggest that 8 out of 10 children would naturally pass through gender dysphoria during puberty. Now, despite this, schools are aggressively promoting transgender ideology in children as young as 4 and 5 years of age. One of the leaders in this area, ironically enough, has been the Church of England. In its published guidelines called Valuing All God's Children, it quotes Stonewall, an LGBT charity, as much as it quotes the Bible. Whether intended or not, the guidelines are in essence an affirmation of transgender ideology. And Bible-believing parents who have sent their children to Church of England schools to receive a Christian education have been the ones having their parental rights violated in relation to this issue. Nigel and Sally Rowe are Christian parents who hold and wish to instill in their children a biblically centered belief in gender. Beliefs that would include Genesis 1:27, where scripture says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created him." Or Matthew 19:4, where Christ says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" Now, in seeking to raise their children according to their Christian beliefs, they sent their 2 sons to a Church of England school on the Isle of Wight. It makes sense. Christian parents sending their kids to a Christian school. Within 2 school years, both of their children, ages 6 and 8 at the time, found themselves in classes with boys who, under their parents and the school's direction, were to be identified as girls. Now, because of the confusion and discomfort suffered by their older son, he was removed from the school and home educated since a few years ago. Nigel and Sally attempted to work the matter out with the school in relation to their youngest son. In a response to a letter that the family sent to the school asking about anti-bullying measures and their own parental rights, the school responded by suggesting that anyone who could not believe that these two children were actually girls or refused to use female pronouns would be viewed by the school as being transphobic. The school also announced their intention to educate parents and students alike in accordance with the transgender identity ideology. Now, the result has been that Nigel and Sally have now removed their youngest son, and litigation over the matter will commence imminently. The Christian Legal Center, where I serve as legal counsel, have nearly identical cases elsewhere involving several other Christian schools. So similarly, the Christian Legal Center has supported Joshua Sutcliffe, a math teacher sacked for misgendering a student. So precisely stated, he used a female pronoun for a student who was biologically female, but who wished to be identified as a boy. For this, Joshua, a devout Christian who didn't even intend to cause offense, has been pushed out of that job. The compelled use of gender pronouns or gender-neutral pronouns has become mainstreamed in most schools in the United Kingdom. Some schools have adopted gender-neutral uniforms or allowed pupils to wear the uniform of their choice. A child, for example, can wear a boy's uniform one day and a girl's uniform the other, depending on how they are feeling that particular day. Other schools are adopting gender-neutral toileting facilities or letting children who identify as trans use the same bathrooms as children of a different biological sex. In one case, I've been working on a very large and prominent school where they would give 5-year-old boys dolls and girls clothing items to play with, while girls would receive boys' toys and clothing to wear. They were taught that they could wear whatever they were comfortable wearing or play with whatever toys they wanted to. The effect of such teaching on a vulnerable and innocent 5-year-old child should be obvious to anyone viewing. Let me be clear. School policies which affirm a child in their gender confusion are highly damaging to the children involved. Case in point, Stonewall, the LGBT charity I mentioned earlier, has suggested that despite a 1/3 decrease in homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying, 84% of young people who identify as transgendered still self-harm, while an additional 45% have attempted to take their own lives. In the last part of the presentation, I also explained the many social and psychological problems facing trans people in their adulthood. Leading experts in the area of psychiatry and pediatrics argue that abundant scientific evidence exists showing that transgender affirming policies do none of the children they are meant to serve any real or lasting good, that it harms the vast majority of them, and that it leads to catastrophic outcomes for many such afflicted children. The reality is simple, and we should be open and honest about it. From the moment of conception, our sex is determined by our chromosomes, that is, whether there is an X or Y chromosome that implants in the egg. As early as 8 weeks gestation, endogenously produced sex hormones cause prenatal brain imprinting that ultimately influences postnatal behaviors. Up to 6,500 genes in any given tissue in our bodies is sex differentiated. That means, for example, in a female breast tissue, the cells would be differentiated specifically to a female's physiology, allowing for lactation and breastfeeding. We find genetic sex differentiation among our tissue to be the highest in the reproductive organs. That shouldn't be a surprise. But it is also present in brain tissue, muscle tissue, and fat, just to give some examples. Even the United Kingdom's Gender Recognition Act reflects this truth by exempting certain sports from the act, realizing that even after gender reassignment surgery, there are physical realities that remain which could lead to unfair competition or even safety issues. So the question arises as to how does this false and overly broad reading of what gender reassignment means affect parental rights? How does it affect the rights of school employees and other students? The answer, I suggest, is simple. Manifestation of gender reassignment, as defined so liberally, is pervasive of everyday life in a way that other protected characteristics rarely are. A person who wishes to manifest a different gender may seek to be known by a different name, use different pronouns, seek different toileting or changing facilities, or to use the same toileting or changing facilities of those of their so-called acquired gender. They may request to use gender-neutral uniforms or be able to dress in the uniform of their acquired gender, as I mentioned earlier. This is a manifestation that is very public, and it pervades the everyday life and activities of the school community. The manifestation of gender reassignment in the structures, the routines, and the interactions of everyday school life is also particularly invasive of the thought, conscience, and religion of other students and school employees. The request to be known by a different name, or for the use of different pronouns, or use of shared changing facilities, for example, requires others repeatedly, even perpetually, to acquiesce in the denial of what they hold to be a central tenet of their religion or belief, namely the belief that gender is God-given and manifests biologically at conception, and that it cannot and should not be subverted. As well as being pervasive and invasive of everyday school life, manifestation of gender reassignment is likely to persist for a significant period of time. The fact that students may get used to it over time does not diminish the depth of the challenge that it represents to fundamental Christian belief about the right ordering of the world. The challenge cannot be limited to the initial manifestation, even if some get used to the situation after a period of initial shock. If anything, the persistent nature of the manifestation is an even greater challenge, since there is a greater chance of routine and the largely unnoticed challenge to Christian belief through the moral signaling of practices that are permitted by authority structures such as teachers and head teachers. What's more, there is no scientific basis for using transgender affirming policies in our schools. While some researchers have reported that they have identified some factors associated with the persistence of gender dysphoria into adulthood, there really is no evidence whatsoever that any clinician can identify the perhaps 2% to 20% of children, depending on the study you're looking at, for whom gender dysphoria will persist with anything approaching certainty. However well-meaning the intentions of schools in implementing so-called transgender affirming policies, the reality is that those policies are unnecessarily perpetuating gender confusion to the long-term detriment and health of the children involved. Even more serious is that these policies encourage children taking puberty-blocking drugs and thereafter hormone treatment, both of which have significant and irreversible health risks. As I discussed in the first part of my presentation, often these policies are adopted in the naive belief that they are helping people, or because the authority figure in charge is afraid of being labeled as transphobic. In the case of education, campaigners have successfully introduced their ideology into schools through the Department for Education and through schools. Being afraid of receiving a bad review from the government school inspectorate, they go well beyond what is legally required of them in promoting these issues out of a sense of fear or of obligation. It is always important to remember that tolerance is not love. In fact, tolerating policies which give short-term relief to children but have long-term and serious consequences for many of these children is not charitable. I would suggest the opposite. It is lazy and it is immoral. For that reason, I would like to thank everyone watching today. You are the frontline warriors for what is good and what is right in the world. In the UK, we have lost our way. Views that show any dissent from the sexual orthodox of the day are quickly marginalized or shouted down. It is my hope that Korea can handle this issue better than we have in Europe. We need people like you, the people watching this presentation more than ever, people willing to stand up for truth no matter the consequences. Such courage is in very short demand these days. So I thank you for taking a brave stand. I thank you for all you do. The consequences of not taking a principled stand on this issue are dramatic. Already in the short time that this matter has been in vogue, countless children have been affected and will live with the long-term psychological, spiritual, emotional, and sometimes physical consequences of this agenda. It is for them and for our own children and for truth that we will continue to fight. Thank you.